Have you ever been looking through a list of games and come across titles you never knew existed? Even now in 2024, I still find games I didn't know about, or at least haven't played very much of. Sometimes it's an arcade port I didn't know about, or it was a popular game that was moved over to a much weaker platform. That idea motivated me to put together this episode for you. I'm gonna take a look at some popular games that showed up in places I didn't expect. Not all of these are direct ports or conversions, but they are popular IPs and series you probably know quite well. Sometimes the results were surprisingly good, and sometimes they were profoundly disappointing. I've got 13 games for you, so let's get started. Bonk Adventure was such a great platformer when it appeared on the TurboGrafx in 1990. It was colorful, offered up some new gameplay moves over your typical platformer, and it had a fun and appealing character in the center of it all. NEC would use Bonk as the mascot of the platform for a few years, and he received a few sequels and spin-offs from there. Bonk also had his very own arcade game and even got a couple of Super Nintendo adventures eventually. But the place I never thought in a million years I'd see Bonk was on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Yet in 1993, that's what happened. Bonk's Adventure in all its glory was right there on 1983 technology, and for the most part, it was an outstanding port. It sees a reduction in color, but in terms of sprite size, animation, music, and level design, you couldn't have wished for a closer representation of the PC Engine original. I was so impressed by this the first time I saw it, I thought it was fake. It's a real game, however, and one you should definitely check out if you've never played it. After it was clear that TurboGrafx wasn't going to be a huge seller, Bonk was moved around to numerous platforms. But out of all of those, this one right here was the biggest and most pleasant of surprises. In 1992, Contra III: The Alien Wars made its debut on the Super Nintendo. The two-player action came to define that genre, and that new Super Nintendo edition took the series to new heights of graphics and sound. Surely any port of this sucker would need to go to another powerful 16-bit system, right? Nope, because in 1994, the freaking Game Boy of all systems received it. When I saw it, I just had to chuckle to myself about how badly this conversion must look, sound, and play in comparison. Surely Konami had lost their minds thinking that a game this good could run on a platform like the Game Boy. Turns out it was better suited than I ever would have believed. Konami had that 8-bit hardware running full bore because Contra III is an outstanding portable experience. As you'd expect, the Mode 7 effects have been either removed entirely or mimicked to a much lesser degree here. The overhead areas are still there, but they do not rotate the same way they did in the original. The speed of the game is also slower to account for the smaller screen and the blurring that would often occur. But for all intents and purposes, this is the Super Nintendo game. Boss encounters are mostly faithful, the weapons are here, and it makes excellent use of the Super Game Boy if you have one. The music is very different, but I really enjoyed it. It has that funky Game Boy vibe to it that grows on you after a few sessions. Factor 5 of Turrican fame handled this port, and they pulled off the impossible in the best of ways. My friends and I wasted countless days and credits at the bowling alley playing Mortal Kombat 2 at its release. When the 16-bit home ports landed, we jumped on those as well. The popularity was immense, and just being able to talk about it at school or with your friends motivated you to find a way to play it. When I first saw the Game Gear box, I thought this must be the absolute worst way to play this game. And you know, I was right. The janky slideshow gameplay is a far cry from the arcade and 16-bit versions. The animations are slow and framey, characters were cut out, and it lost all but 2 of the backgrounds. Your first impressions are not strong with this one, and many will likely never try it because of that. I came in looking for something that resembled the arcade experience. You aren't going to get that here, and you'll come away cursing its existence. The visuals themselves are decent enough for an 8-bit handheld. The sprites are large and represent the fighters well. The developer Probe used background tiles to achieve this, but it causes a very choppy gameplay experience. So much so, the animation almost seems like it just flashes frame to frame without any smoothness at all. The sound effects and voices are of course substantially neutered, but the music still has that matte furnace twang to it that serves it well. Once you adjust to the choppy movement, the gameplay does come together in something slightly resembling a one-on-one fighter. It's never good, hell it's never even just okay, but after a few matches there can be some laughs once you get good at it. Surprisingly, both Kentaro and Shao Kahn remain as final bosses. There was a Master System version released in PAL regions that gives you a larger playfield, but this one is better left in your memories. The ravages of time have made it virtually unplayable today.
Fight!
Batman games were once upon a time some of the best in the business. The 1989 movie spawned a number of releases by Sunsoft, who made an incredible NES action game with some of the best music on that platform. Then they made a Sega Genesis version that sounded just as nice, that was again a really fun game in its own right. Among those 2 unforgettable titles, they made a 3rd Batman game for NEC's PC Engine. Instead of porting one of their previous efforts, they chose to go in another direction entirely. This time they went for a top-down maze runner where Batman must collect items to move on to the next stage. It was a radical departure from the other Batman games in their stable, and it remained only in Japan. This was such a weird change of direction from the other 2 games. 2 multi-directional side-scrollers with tons of action against this rather tame execution of the IP seemed incredibly out of place. It's not that this version is bad, because it's really not. It has a great soundtrack and it plays well for what it is. It's just that it's so different from the others. Perhaps Sunsoft was short on time and created this under a crunch, or maybe a previous license deal kept them from porting over their other works. Whatever happened, it ended up giving us a version of Batman the video game I don't think anyone was expecting. Most of us remember Splatterhouse. Whether you played it in the arcade or on the TurboGrafx, this was one of the first games that ever attempted a real horror story and atmosphere. But did you ever expect to see a version of it on Nintendo's 8-bit Famicom? In 1989, Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti was released only in Japan, a satirical take on the original's more serious tone. It uses the big-headed and little-bodied art style to execute its humor more effectively, and it's a wild departure from the original in pretty much every way. Instead of focusing on beat-em-up elements, it opts for a more action platformer approach to the action. The story has the Pumpkin King kidnapping your girlfriend, and you have to get her back. Many of the scenarios and enemies are based on popular media of the time, so you'll recognize quite a few if you have any age on you at all. The visuals and sound are your typical 8-bit staples of smaller sprites and music that is shockingly pleasant. It was done by Now Production, the same company that did the Sega Genesis sequels, parts 2 and 3. This one really is a missed gem because I didn't know about it for years. When I finally did find it, I dismissed it because I thought it'd be a cut-down port of the original arcade. It's so much more than that though, and it is very much worth the effort to play it. It's tough, but a password system really helps you out. It was also included in Namco Museum Archives Volume 1 for the Nintendo Switch quite recently. Back in the day, Double Dragon was released for just about everything. If the console or computer had any real standing in the industry, it got a port of it. Even the handhelds of the time got their own games. But I have to confess I was still shocked someone attempted a port of it to the Atari 2600. I mean, the platform had been long dead when Double Dragon was released in the arcade in 1987. The NES and Master System had replaced it, and those were the versions you wanted to play. Even though I had heard of it for years, I still never took the time to sit down and play it. Until now, in this very video. Yep, this is the first time I have ever really sat down and played this one seriously, and it quickly became apparent why I had no desire to go after it before. This port of Double Dragon is awful in every way. I expected the sound and visual cutbacks. I mean, it's 1970s hardware after all, but that gameplay is just vinegar on an open and festering wound of an experience. Any attempt to actually fight is met with immediate destruction by the ridiculous AI. After being annihilated numerous times, I realized the only thing that you can do is just constantly elbow smash the computer to get anywhere. You could spam the elbow in other versions as well, but at least in those you could do other things to mix it up a little. You can argue all day about how this was impressive on a technical level because of the ancient hardware all you want. The end result is a poor playing experience that failed on every level to be the least bit fun. I'm no 2600 fan, so it might just be that kid in me that despised its mediocre arcade ports all those years ago, still talking. But this game is just as much fun as those old Tiger handhelds, and that ain't saying much. As I've said on my channel a few times, I was not privy to computer gaming in my early years. I never knew anyone that had a C64, Amiga, or Atari computer while they were relevant. I was 23 years old before I owned a Windows-based PC, and much older than that before I really discovered everything that had to offer. Diablo was a game I had wanted to play when it was released in 1997. It was all the rage at the local Babbage's game store and everyone was talking about it. Not having a PC at that time meant I had to wait for a console port that likely wouldn't be happening. At least I didn't think so at the time. Yet in early 1998, Diablo showed up on the PlayStation in a surprisingly playable conversion. It's true it lacks the sparkle of the higher resolution and performance of the PC edition, but for someone new to the game, this was perfectly acceptable. The core fun factor remained intact and it even had a multiplayer mode. It was incredibly easy to get into and get lost in its lore and hunting for the best loot. It retained the original game's 3 character classes and its randomized dungeons. You could build a warrior and sink 40 hours into him, only to turn around and try one of the other classes and do it all over again. It was slow and plodding at times, but it was the kind of title that you turn the lights down and really enjoyed its atmosphere. It was this game right here that started my love for the series, and I've played them all quite a bit since. Diablo on the PlayStation here plays a bit different with a controller, but once you adjust, it was just as fun a time. I was a fan of the NES Castlevania the second I took control of the main character and heard that timeless soundtrack. Then the others came along and endeared me to the franchise even more. As the years went on, I discovered more Castlevania titles I had never played, and some I had never even heard of. When I sat down with Castlevania on the Amiga for the first time, I was expecting something akin to the NES game being ported to the Sega Genesis, but what I got was nothing of the kind. It was released in 1990 and developed by Novo Trade of Echo the Dolphin fame. It was a remake of the original Castlevania NES edition, with an upgraded presentation. And I use upgraded loosely, however, because some things here come off notably worse. There's no question the color use has been amped up in places, but the questionable art changes go into effect right from the opening zombies. I mean, these 10-foot tall hopping monstrosities look so out of place. I was also quite displeased with the sound and music. While some Amiga games could sound great, this is light years behind the NES original and just sounds wrong across the board. Every time you catch a familiar melody and think it's going to get better, it veers off into some out-of-place change that destroys it entirely. But as iffy as the presentation was, it's nothing compared to how broken the gameplay is. Choppy, stuttering, near slideshow levels of movement and animation take this from the classic it's based on to a broken mess of unplayable garbage. Just navigating the main character left and right feels wrong, and every jump feels like you are about to careen straight into a pit death. Most of the boss encounters are little more than whipping as fast as you can to kill them, and there is no ending here whatsoever. I'd rather sit through any amount of Dark Castle, Castlevania 64, or ET gameplay challenges than have to play this shameful exhibition of tedious and insulting time wasting again. The developers and the publishers should have released their next game free of charge to make up for this travesty. The mere fact that they felt this was worth money is just plain highway robbery. Platform apologists will try and tell you that it has its merits, and I disagree 100%. It's a shit show of monumental proportions, and should be stricken from history before it has a chance to disappoint any more fans of this classic IP. Very similar to Diablo, Command & Conquer was another PC game I had heard so much about but couldn't play at its release. It came out in 1995, an overhead strategy game where you built your army, gathered resources, and fought a war of attrition until the other side was eradicated. Fortunately, in late 1996, the Sega Saturn got a very good port of the game thanks to Westwood Studios and Virgin. You have to play it with the controller, but it does a serviceable job that allows a really good experience. It comes on 2 CDs with each one representing the 2 sides of the story. There's lots of different units to use, a fairly robust story for this type of game, and lots of cinematics to tell it. You won't get the higher resolutions of the PC version, but it still manages to look and sound decent all the same. At the time, these kinds of games were a godsend to home consoles even without the smoother and faster mouse support. Computers tended to be an expensive investment at the time, so getting quality ports meant the world to a console-only gamer like me. There's many better ways to play this today, but back then, the Saturn was up to the task and handled it quite well.
Plot building captured. base is under attack.
When Donkey Kong Country was released in 1994, it was all the rage. Magazines heaped high scores on it and called it a 32-bit game on 16-bit hardware. TV ads bombarded you with its merits, giving the Super Nintendo a shot of adrenaline right at a time when Sega was abandoning the Genesis in favor of its 32-bit plans. I confess I never took to the hype. I always thought it played okay, but was nowhere near as good as Mario World or Yoshi's Island. But I'd be a fool to argue its impact. Most Super Nintendo fans loved it, and it quickly spawned multiple sequels that sold great as well. The inevitable ports to other consoles didn't come until the end of 2000, when the Game Boy Color received it, courtesy of Rare themselves. Now, the Game Boy Color was no hardware juggernaut. It was still 8-bit and only a mild improvement over the original Game Boy, which was a decade old at that point. Even for a 1998 release, the Game Boy Color was still nowhere near as powerful or advanced as the Super Nintendo. Yet its version of Donkey Kong Country is surprisingly good. The color is of course cut back and the sound is different, but as far as the core experience, it's pretty much all here. The gameplay feels right, the stages and collectibles have that familiar layout and fun factor, and I was pleasantly surprised by the music. It's different, but like many Game Boy games, it has a style all its own and actually serves the title well. The only thing that sucked here was the fact Nintendo didn't have a damn backlight in the device, so you always had to play it beside a lamp to see the screen. The Game Boy Advance version would eventually supplant it as the best portable version, but for a time, Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Color was more than adequate. PUO Sun was originally an arcade game released in 1996 for the STV Titan board. Shortly thereafter, it came to the Japanese Sega Saturn console in what was a perfect port. The PlayStation got a port of it that same year. Sega would eventually acquire the PUO license from Compile and begin to deal it out to other platforms. In 2003, Sega reissued the port of Sun to the first PlayStation under their own banner, if you can believe it. It's one of only 2 games that was published by and carry the Sega name for that platform. The other was a tambourine music game that had some funky controllers made for it. I was always fascinated by the popularity of this franchise in Japan, and even more so that Sega actually published original PlayStation games. The console was nearly a decade old in Japan at that point. Kinda makes you wonder what some of Sega's other games might have looked like on Sony's first console.
Yeah. 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 Kiss me. Yeah. Yeah. Kiss me. Yeah. Yeah.
Golden Axe is well known, be it arcade or Genesis versions. Its hack and slash beat 'em up action defined the Sega experience at the time. Easy to play, with great sound and visuals. The Genesis version added an extra stage and boss fight that in some ways made it better than the arcade, which was really cool because it released just a year later. In 2002, Bandai took that Genesis version and published a port of it on their Wonderswan Color handheld in Japan. It has the extra stage and boss and even looks and sounds similar to it. The gameplay feels quite different, however, with attacks, throws, running, and hit detection coming off feeling strange in comparison. When I first played it, I had my ass whooped quickly. It took a number of tries to adjust to the way it plays, but once you do, you'll defeat it in no time. This was released at a time when it was so weird seeing Sega games on platforms other than those made by Sega. This was especially true for me because I was not a computer guy, so I didn't see the many ports there until later. The Wonderswan library never really impressed me much, but it was still fun to see something like this still getting released. It must have sold like crap though, because it goes for $300 on the gray market. Sonic the Hedgehog was a regular on Sega consoles starting in 1991. Master System, Genesis, Game Gear, Saturn, and Dreamcast all saw multiple games in the series, and he was the face of Sega from the moment he showed up. That's why it was so strange to see him pop up on the Neo Geo Pocket Color in 1999. Sonic Pocket Adventure was a throwback to the original Genesis outings, incorporating design elements from all those games into one extremely solid title. The visuals look like a slightly upgraded Master System version, and the speed here is very nice. Stage design looks mostly like the stuff you saw in Sonic 2, though the layouts are wildly different. The Neo Geo Pocket Color also does a very nice job with the music, which itself is a throwback to past games. From the way you collect Chaos Emeralds in the bonus stages, to the many hidden areas in each of the stages, it was Sonic the way we loved him during the 16-bit generation. I dare say it was the best Sonic had been in years, and I consider this an absolute must-play for fans of the series. Sonic Team oversaw its development with SNK handling the programming duties, and they made absolute magic together. It has link cable support for 2-player competitive matches, and there is a puzzle mode where you collect pieces in the main game to put them together. This was 2 years before Sonic Advance, and just a few months after the Dreamcast made its US debut. The tiny installed base of the Neo Geo Pocket Color meant that many people never got to experience this gem, but emulation should make it accessible to you if that's still the case. I'd love to see Sega revisit this game and reissue it on modern devices. It doesn't get anywhere near the love it deserves. Seeing certain ports and IP show up on different consoles and handhelds always was really interesting to me. Sometimes it was cool seeing how the game fared on different hardware, and sometimes you were just interested in the behind the scenes reasons the game existed at all. My biggest regret with some of these is that I dismissed them based on preconceived notions that made me believe they weren't worth my time. Just because a game was redone on weaker hardware didn't always mean it was going to be unplayable, and sometimes it could really surprise you. If you like the premise of this episode, I have many more options we can tackle in a part 2. If you have any suggestions, I'd love to hear them, especially when it comes to computer versions I may not be familiar with. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.